Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event of the Bipartisan Policy Center and our Direct Air Capture Council. We are here today to make the case for direct air capture and carbon removal. We have a delightful three-part presentation here for the next rough hour or so. Shortly, I will have the honor of introducing Senator Hickenlooper, who is going to lead us off with some keynote remarks. I will then turn it over to my colleague, Sasha Mackler, who directs the energy work here at BPC, for a conversation with Dr. Suchi Talati, who is the Chief of Staff at the DOE Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. And then I have the pleasure of a conversation with two good friends of BPC, both members of our Direct Air Capture Council, Byron Dorgan and Marty Durb. So just to kind of set the stage to introduce our keynote speaker, there has been remarkable dynamic progress in the attention to and technology case for direct air capture in the last several years. I think really prior to 2013, there were no commercial enterprises investing real resources in direct air capture removal technology. I think one of the turning points in our view was the 2014 IPCC study, which asserted global warming is effectively irreversible unless measures are taken to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And this was consequential both in its ecological honesty, but it also really started to reshape the debate, because I think most climate advocacy over the last 20 years had a lot of ambivalence around carbon removal. The idea that somehow focusing on carbon removal would take the imperative away from carbon reduction. And there had been a long-standing sense of reluctance in the environmental community to recognize this imperative. And I think the science around IPCC really started to change that debate. It is not that this is a topic without controversy, but I think most now recognize, most who are using pencils and calculators, that absent the ability to remove carbon from the atmosphere, is going to be very difficult to reach the sustainable 1.5 degree Celsius maximum warming that I think most people believe is in fact the right global goal. And other things changed also. I would give a lot of credit to a good friend of ours, Larry Linden and the Linden Trust, who several years ago recognized that this was an undiscovered space in the climate advocacy debate and brought together a lot of resources and people to really start to explore some of these questions. And so I think we've seen this situation changing in a very productive way. We're also, I think, going to talk about the business community. Not only does carbon reduction create headroom in the economy, the recognition that that last 10% is very hard to reduce, it also makes a strong economic case, because we have found in all of our analysis that when you get to that 94, 95% reduction strategy, the costs can go up very considerably. So I think there's a strong business case and a lot of interest in the net behind net zero we will talk about. Just a word about political momentum. The president's budget has a line item for carbon dioxide removal. It is the first time in our nation's 240-something year history that a president's budget had a line item for carbon removal. The president's jobs plan focuses on the SCALE Act and improvements to 45Q and the significant investments that are necessary to accelerate these demonstrations. Just this morning, Senator Manchin held a hearing on the energy technology package that he is proposing become a centerpiece of the bipartisan infrastructure negotiations, which are looking quite positive, at least for the last 36 hours. I hope Senator Hickenlooper might share a little optimism with us on that. But this proposal for $3.5 billion for 4 direct air capture hubs, I think, is a very consequential recognition of the need for scale and speed. So we come to this conversation at a terrific moment, and we really have a great first speaker who I now have the honor of introducing, Senator John Hickenlooper, who in 2020 was elected to represent the great state of Colorado. Senator Hickenlooper really kind of embraces the BPC ethos, the fierce urgency of pragmatism. He is evidence-based, he is science-driven, he is just fundamentally collaborative in spirit, but impatient, which of course is the right way to be when facing a challenge like climate change. He also brings a lot of life experience to the table. So I think most people know he was the mayor of Denver and the governor of Colorado. He also has unique experience when it comes to carbon sequestration. He was an expert in short-term sequestration by founding and creating the Wynkoop Brewing Company, which sequestered carbon for short periods of time, but in very important socially meaningful ways. More important though, he is a geologist. I think he might be the only geologist in the Senate. He will correct me if I'm wrong. But this is in serious terms, helps him understand just the realities of the physical challenge of permanence and what it really means to sequester something from an ecological standpoint forever. I also think that geologic time is probably helpful in creating that sense of patience that he brings to his negotiations with other senators, since that can be a sometimes slow and occasionally challenging process. But when it comes to the challenge and the opportunity around scaling direct air capture, carbon sequestration, we really couldn't have a better speaker to kick us off. And so I turn it now to you, Senator Hickenlooper, to share some thoughts.
Thank you, Jason. And I want to thank everybody at the Bipartisan Policy Center for putting on the event and inviting me to speak on direct air capture. I'll probably avoid going into the bipartisan infrastructure agreement that appears to be very, very close. I think they're celebrating it, so it must be. I think they might actually have crossed over the line of success there, which is, I think, important for a whole variety of reasons. Many of them clearly articulated by the Bipartisan Policy Center, that this country is looking for bipartisan solutions to some of these intractable problems we're facing. And equally important, the world is judging our democracy, and indeed looking, in many countries, they're looking at democracy with questions as whether we can do as good a job addressing these global issues as more, I'm not going to go on too far out and describe any of whether it's China or some of the other countries that do not allow the same level of freedom that we do. But clearly there is competition, and the agreement on the bipartisan infrastructure today is a big step forward. Now, getting back to direct air capture and carbon sequestration, I mean, there's no doubt this has a central role to play in addressing climate change. And the reports the council's done on the quote unquote case for DAC, direct air capture, they speak to this and the need for bipartisan solutions and solutions that really have to be lasting. Climate change is, by any person's measure, if you're going to look at it honestly, it's the existential threat of our time, and it does demand that we act with a level of urgency, of fierce urgency. Direct air capture is the one technology that could actually bring a new element to the efforts and the negotiations. As most of you know, DAC is unique among clean energy technologies. While direct air capture may not be playing as large a role in the calculations about how we get to a net zero economy, it's not playing as large a role as, say, solar or wind. There are very compelling reasons to think that in the not so distant future, it will be playing a larger role. A lot of this is what Jason was just talking about. I think the big deal on direct air capture, unlike other technology, the big deal is the cost. Direct air capture actually puts if you think about it, it puts a ceiling on the cost of addressing climate change. And that's actually remarkable. DAC directly puts a ceiling on the cost of addressing climate change. It does this while removing carbon that we've already emitted. So in simple terms, we can pull a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere anywhere we want in order to cancel out another ton emitted anywhere else in the world. What this essentially means is that we can help, if we had enough money, we could buy our way out of the climate crisis. Now, the price tag would argue that that's not really practical. Today, the cost of capturing and storing a single ton of CO2 is somewhere in the neighborhood of $200, really up to $600 per ton. And so if you look at the world emissions, let's say 50 billion tons of CO2 per year, when you put that $200 to $600 a ton in there, you're looking at 10 to 30 trillion dollars a year. And obviously, that's not going to happen. The good news is that for every dollar per ton that we can bring the cost of direct air capture down, the maximum cost of solving climate change comes down 50 billion per year. Now that doesn't in any way deny how serious this is, and I mean those are just insane numbers. If you find a way of cutting the cost of direct air capture down by $1 per ton, you save $50 billion. That means we would be spending $50 billion if we don't do anything. And I think there's more to it than that. DAC also lets us capture the tons of CO2 that we can't avoid emitting right now. In many cases, some of the industrial products that we so far have been unable to find substitutes for, concrete, steel, you can go down the list. Air travel is another one. There's no other technology out there that even come close to how transformative direct air capture could be were we to find a way to bring it in line by price. And the price is so far out of line that people worry that it might displace renewable energy in some way. That's clearly not going to happen. There's such a big delta between what direct air capture costs and what renewables are providing. That's not going to happen, but it is important to be able and willing to have those discussions. The other part of this equation is the sheer level of concentrated effort and ambition to advance this technology. Today, our highest performing direct air capture facilities have the ability to capture several thousand tons of CO2 per year. But what's remarkable is how the industry, enabled largely by public policy, is skipping the steps on the development ladder. We're jumping from several thousand tons to a facility that will be able to capture 1 million tons in a year. Not so long ago, this was a pipe dream, and now it's scaling up at a staggering rate. Now, 1 million tons of CO2 per year sounds like a large number, and I guess in some contexts it is, but in the context of climate change, 1 million tons is de minimis. It's literally a drop in the bucket. The IPCC has called for as much as 20 gigatons of carbon removal by the year 2020. 20 gigatons, 20,000 megatons. We have a huge amount of work to do to meet the moment, and direct air capture is not going to do all of it. I think whether DAC can make a dent in emissions will largely come down to cost and financing. As many of you know, the capture part of direct air capture is only a step of the process. What you do with the carbon next is every bit as important. Right now, we can use that carbon for a variety of things. We can put it into cement. We can use it for enhanced oil recovery. You can use it to carbonate beer, as Jason mentioned. But there's not nearly enough beer or cement in the world to store the volume of carbon we're talking about. And that's where the problem is. Unlike the utility that pays you for your solar energy, or the working family that buys your electric vehicle, the ground pays you exactly nothing to deposit carbon dioxide into it. That means when it comes to investment, the financing of direct air capture is really unlike any of the other technologies. Even the traditional policy tricks like investment tax credits won't work on this by themselves. It does no good to give someone a 30% off coupon on something that still costs 70 cents on the dollar to install and even more to operate if the final product doesn't return you anything. That's why we need to ultimately put a price on carbon that accurately reflects the cost of every ton of CO2 we choose to store in the atmosphere rather than on the ground. But until we get a price on carbon, tax credits like 45Q will have to do the work by applying that price by at least applying that price to the sequestration part of the equation. We're putting a signal in place that the market is capable of responding to. Currently, that signal tops out at about $50 a ton, nowhere near large enough to meet where the technology is in terms of the actual costs of carbon capture. That's why a bipartisan group of us in the Senate have sponsored a bill to amend 45Q and raise the tax credit awarded for each ton of CO2 captured and stored to as much as $120 a ton. Now, obviously, we can't afford to do that ad infinitum. It's just a start. Meeting the moment will require a build out of our CO2 transportation infrastructure, such as in the SCALE Act, the ability to efficiently site and permit Class 6 wells for the long-term permanent storage of CO2. We also need to invest in R&D on the back end to find new ways of bringing each of these costs down. Direct air capture has an unrivaled ability to reshape our fight against climate change. But to realize that potential, it's going to require massive technological advancement, significant scale up, and that means bipartisan efforts in Congress, which is where I started this, so where Jason started this discussion. We do have significant challenges. I remain optimistic. It's a small business entrepreneur in me. I know what we have to do. I think we all know that, and we know that the actions we take today are going to have a real impact on generations to come, and we need to make them count. So thank you for all the work you've done to get us to this point. I think one of the real pushes I'll reemphasize is that we need to get a price on carbon, whatever that looks like. Now even the major oil companies are coming forward and saying that a price on carbon makes sense. We need to translate these changes of heart into direct action, really put a price on carbon, and that's going to be a fulcrum to accelerate our advances in direct air capture as well. Anyway, thank you for all the work you've done, and appreciate your letting me have a few minutes of your time.
Well, hey, everybody. I'm Sasha Mackler, and as Jason mentioned, I lead the energy project at the BPC. And on behalf of all of us, I wanted to thank the Senator for those really thoughtful remarks. Really appreciate your time today and for your leadership on these issues. Your comments are a great segue to the rest of our discussion today, where we'll be talking more about the policy imperative and the policy agenda associated with scaling up these technologies in the basket of direct air capture, and what role the federal government needs to play in meeting the private sector and sort of bringing these technologies forward. So we thank you for your time today, and we will now move on to the next part of the agenda, which is something I'm really looking forward to, a conversation with Suchi Talati, who is the Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Energy in the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Really thrilled to have Suchi here with us today. She most recently, before her time at the Department of Energy, was a senior policy advisor at Carbon 180, which is an NGO focused on a lot of issues and policy issues and technologies in the carbon removal space. And before that, she was a fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and so she has a lot of background on the policy intersections, of course, associated with the climate challenge and the energy and carbon removal components to that. Dr. Talati has an academic background, starting with a BS from Northwestern. She's done her master's at Columbia and a PhD in engineering and policy from Carnegie Mellon. So spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. Before I turn to the discussion with Suchi, I wanted to just say a little bit about the Direct Air Capture Council at the BPC. We are a group that came together in 2019, really bringing together a variety of perspectives on this issue of direct air capture and the opportunities it presents. We have folks from the private sector, former political officials, folks from the academic and NGO community, and from the business community. And together, we think we can help to inform and drive the agenda around direct air capture, which is really starting to take shape now, as we heard from the Senator, and is one of the things we want to discuss with Dr. Talati. We are today releasing the third report in a series that we've been working on over the course of the last year, the first of which outlined the environmental case for DAC. The second report outlined the commercial case and the commercial opportunities for direct air capture. And today we're putting forward a federal policy agenda, which we'll hear more about as we go through the rest of the program, but it really focuses on three key components. One is a significantly enhanced RD&D program that we believe should be led by the Department of Energy. Second is enhancing the current financial incentives that exist for carbon capture and tailoring them to support direct air capture. And we're thinking really primarily of the 45Q tax credit. And third is to start to think about initial markets for direct air capture that can help propel the technologies forward. And we have a lot more to say about all of those things in the report that you can find on our website. But with no further ado, I'd like to turn to the conversation with Suchi. We're really thrilled to have you here with us today. Maybe just to start off at a high level, just turning back to something that Jason mentioned at the outset. The president's budget this year included a line item for carbon dioxide removal for the first time ever. What do you have to say, or how is the Department of Energy thinking about CDR right now, and what's on the near-term horizon?
Thanks so much, Sasha, and I'm so happy to be here with you to talk to you about DAC and CDR and these incredibly important issues. The CDR budget line is really significant. It's really saying that for the first time we have directed focus to CDR at DOE. We've worked on DAC in the past, and we've really leveraged the work that we've done in our CCUS R&D program, especially when it comes to the carbon management that DAC has to be coupled to, whether that's use in products or reliable storage. These are really important pieces of DAC that we are ensuring that we're moving forward, as well as kind of the capture part of that equation. And so that 63 million in the budget for FY22, the FY22 request is not just to advance direct air capture, but also bioenergy coupled to carbon capture and storage and enhanced mineralization concepts, which we are really excited about pushing forward. And so I also want to mention that the budget also includes funds for a DAC test center at our National Energy Technology Lab, which is incredibly exciting. We do have the National Carbon Capture Center in Alabama already, and so this would be a really significant step to really move DAC forward and to better understand a lot of those early stage pieces of R&D. I also want to mention that what we're doing at DOE is not just confined to the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. The Office of Science just released $24 million in March for DAC R&D, and we also are focusing on international efforts. Secretary Granholm announced at the Clean Energy Ministerial meeting recently that DOE will be working with our global partners to launch a major mission innovation focused on CDR at COP26. And so we're really working on ensuring that we have partnerships and focus that just really make sense to move these topics forward and to propel these technologies. And also expanding a bit on the mineralization piece, there are so many synergies in this space that have yet to be taken advantage of. Coal fly ash and even some tailings from the mining industry are really rich in magnesium and calcium. And these are elements that react with CO2. And so when we react those with CO2, not only do we get to store the carbon permanently in rocks, those are actually value-added materials that can be used as synthetic aggregate for concrete. The senator mentioned this. That actually leads to that could potentially lead to carbon-negative concrete if we're also using carbon capture on the cement. And so there are so many interesting approaches like that that we really want to focus our attention on, including in situ mineralization, like storing CO2 and basalts. And so we're just really excited to have more funds to be able to explore these exciting technologies.
Well, it's safe to say that we share that enthusiasm. I wanted to, see if we could talk a little bit about what you at the department and your office have been doing recently on DAC. We note that you, recently had an announcement for $12 million in funding for a variety of DAC efforts and DAC technologies in the last month or so. And as we watch what's happening in Congress, there are a variety of ideas in Congress and in the administration to bridge the valley of death, especially when we think about demonstration at scale and deployment for direct air capture. And note that even in Senator Manchin's bill that was discussed this morning in the Senate Energy Committee, there's a proposal to fund 4 large direct air capture hubs across the country. If we look at all that activity and as you at the department are looking ahead, how are you thinking about the demonstration of DAC technologies and what the department in particular can do to help the commercial scale demonstration piece of the innovation puzzle when it comes to direct air capture?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, it's just so important to consider the nuances and differences, not just across kind of the whole RD, D&D spectrum, but even within the demo space, right? Pilot scale projects have different needs than large scale demonstrations. And when it comes to large scale demonstrations, the pieces about, coupling DAC to low carbon energy sources and having a place for that carbon to go also become incredibly important. And so we're trying to think really strategically about how to set up projects for success when it comes to DAC. And so the financing piece, as you know, is incredibly important. And DAC demos are expensive. And so, our budget right now for this request doesn't really have the capacity to invest in the number of projects that we would want to. And so infrastructure packages like the American Jobs Plan and smaller test centers like the DAC test center in our FY22 budget play such an important role in giving DOE the capacity and funds and knowledge to get us there. And so, something like an expanded 45Q tax credit, which is also in AJP that the senator referred to, would deeply help DAC projects coupled to reliable storage. And that's really what we want here. We want to ensure that it's DAC coupled to storage, whether that's in products or in geological reservoirs. And I think that's really where we need to ensure demonstrations are getting the funds they need. And so that's kind of the way that we're thinking about it. And we do want to pivot to these spaces, but doing so strategically and in the right way is our focus.
That's great. Thank you for that answer. Shifting gears a little bit, we know the administration and your office have spoken a lot about the role of environmental justice and community development and community involvement when it comes to the energy transition. Can you outline how fossil energy and carbon management is looking to leverage CDR, if at all, to advance the environmental justice agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. As we pursue CDR and carbon management strategies, we have to be really vigilant in examining, their impacts on communities and ensuring we don't repeat past mistakes. And so while we absolutely want to focus on scaling these critical technologies, we also really have to embed and incorporate that new way of thinking where environmental justice, equity, and workforce development. I feel like CDR is this incredibly unique opportunity where we have the chance to ensure we incorporate and engage local communities while we're still at this early stage, while we're thinking about demos and bringing in communities that have been disempowered and engage them in the decision-making processes. I think this is not something that we have, embarked upon before. And, we as an agency are excited to do this right. And so, one example is, not just determining that we need DAC, which we absolutely do, but also where do we site DAC? And that's a really important question, not just for the technological aspects, which obviously is a really important infrastructure, but also recognizing that they need to be sited in locations where there's support for those projects, where there's community involvement and real benefits for those surrounding populations. And so this administration really wants to prioritize that kind of whole of government approach to address those, our past injustices and committing to make that central to all of climate. And so, one of the big initiatives that I'm sure you've heard of is Justice 40. And so making sure that we deliver 40% of overall benefits of our investments to those disadvantaged communities. And that's a really important piece, right? It's not just investing 40%, but making sure 40% of benefits are given to these communities and really making that a core of thinking about CDR. And I think this is a synergy that is, a new way of thinking about these technologies, but one that I think is going to set, not just these communities up for success, but for DAC ups for success as well.
Yeah, such an important point. I'm really, glad to hear, and we're all, glad to hear that this is a priority for you all, and you're thinking about it on the front end as we look ahead to what role this technology can play in the economy going forward. This is probably the last technical question, and then I'll let you kind of make any final points you want to make before we move on to the next panel. But one thing that we are starting to appreciate here at the BPC as we think about kind of the longer term policy needs for direct air capture, really centers on a somewhat tangential issue, which is the whole notion of carbon accounting and really the need for quality carbon accounting frameworks to help to scale, clean energy technologies generally, but direct air capture, I think, in particular. Is your office or the department working on this in any way, and if so, in what way?
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, accounting frameworks are vital for CDR to be effective and successful. That's especially true for DAC. When it comes to life cycle assessments, DOE has been leading the way. We've been working on this across our national labs for years, but focusing these efforts on CDR is relatively new. And so, we want to ensure that we are taking an all-of-government approach and including all the agencies that have a piece to play in this. And so working with EPA, I think, is a really crucial partnership that we want to build into carbon accounting. Another piece I'd like to mention is that, from the Energy Act, we were asked to build a CDR task force that makes these federal policy recommendations. And so that's something that we're working on standing up and bringing in, all agencies that have, a really important role to play in one room, virtually speaking, and making, really important efforts into moving the space forward. And so it's never happened before. I think the fact that the federal government is bringing together agencies on this topic, not just about accounting, but on justice, about R&D, about innovation, it's just incredibly exciting. And, accounting is going to play such an important role in the success of CDR.
Well, Suchi, I think we could keep talking for another 30 minutes, but we don't have the time for that today. Wanted to, probably pause here and thank you really for your time that you did give us today. We know you're super busy over there at the department, and also for your leadership on these issues. Great to hear all the things that are going on at the department, and we look forward to hearing more. So thanks very much. I'm going to hand things back over to Jason for the next part of the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you, Suchi. And it is now up to me to spend 15 or 20 minutes with two of the leading members of our Direct Air Capture Council, Byron Dorgan and Marty Durb. And if there is time and Zoom enthusiasm, we can also entertain some questions as we go. I think folks can address us through the BPC Live Twitter hashtag or the live chat function on YouTube. But so let me kick this off with some introductions to people who are at least notorious in the direct air capture conversation. First, Senator Byron Dorgan. Byron represented the good people of North Dakota for about 30 years, 6 terms in the House and 3 in the U.S. Senate. He is a visiting professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy. He is the co-chair of the government relations practice at Arendt Fox. I think most consequential, he is a long-standing senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a member of our Direct Air Council. And if I can go off book for a moment, Byron's actually a Direct Air Council prophet. In 2012, he wrote an eco-thriller called Blowout. I promised him at least 3 sales off of this introduction, so I'm counting on you, BPC community. But one of the key, I think, exotic ideas in Blowout was a tremendous scaling up of carbon capture technology in the country. And so maybe Byron can share some thoughts, but maybe a little more on ground. In 2018, he wrote a roll call op-ed titled "Carbon Dioxide Isn't Just a Problem, It is a Lucrative Product," with the subheader "Carbon Ka-ching." So Byron, thank you. You have been at the forefront of this discussion for a while, and look forward to having a conversation with you in a moment. Marty Durb. Marty, as I think many of you know, is the president of the Global Energy Institute at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, a position he has held for the last couple of years. Prior to that, he was the executive vice president and chief strategy officer at the American Petroleum Institute. He was the founding CEO of the American Natural Gas Association, ANGA, spent some time at the American Chemistry Council before it was even called that, did a couple of tours of duty on Capitol Hill. And Marty has really just been a leading thinker on behalf of the nation and globe's largest industries as it comes to the challenge of this energy transition. So I thank you both. I want to talk a little politics, talk a little about the business case, and then maybe if we have time, come back at the end to the question of the need for speed and what we're going to have to do as a country if we're going to scale up the potential of direct air capture in time to avoid the worst effects of a changing climate. But let's start with politics. And Byron, I'm going to ask you to kind of think back a little to 2009. You were the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee during the American Recovery Act. I believe it was about a $787 billion, just a teeny little package. But about 12% of it, 90+ billion, was devoted to clean energy. And before we go really into the details around direct air capture, this moment seems to be repeating itself with Senator Manchin now advancing a major energy title. And just talk a little bit about the potential for a major energy technology component, not just to advance the national interest, but also to kind of bring together this big infrastructure deal. Then, Senator Schumer said there will be a bold climate change component to our infrastructure package. How do you see the process now moving forward based on your history inside the room?
Well, Jason, thank you very much. And I'm happy to be here with you and Marty. Let me just say that I think timing, of course, is everything. And science is sending us a message about that timing right now. And Senator Manchin is in a critically important position. And for him, I would simply say, when you have the opportunity to provide the funding, and funding is very important, and I'll explain why, there's an opportunity to do that and a requirement to do that. We are quite clearly at a tipping point in my judgment. I'm on the EFI National Advisory Board Energy Futures Initiative that Ernie Moniz does. And what they have said and what others have said, and I think you responded to it earlier, Jason, if we do all that is possible to be done with respect to reducing carbon, we can't get there from here. My understanding is we can be unbelievably successful in reduction of carbon, but we can't get where we need to be in doing just that. And that's why we need more. And that's why there's an urgency. I'm sure you've heard me say there's an old Indian chief who once said, the success of a rain dance depends a great deal on timing. Well, you know what? Timing is everything. And timing with respect to these issues and the tipping point that deals with climate change is so important. It's interesting, the history, and I've been through part of this history with the coal-fired generating plants in North Dakota. We've been through reductions. We've went out and required the purchase of scrubbers in those plants. With respect to reductions, we know that if we plant more trees, we have forests or cover crops for farmers, industries making efforts to reduce carbon. Some say you can produce fuel from the carbon that is currently in air, finding fuel from air. Well, with all of those things together, we still need DAC. We still need direct air capture. We just need it for removal purposes. We are in the early stages of that discussion, and that's so important to understand because early stages require us to move to demonstration, and then it requires us to move to deployment at scale. And I, as chairing one of the funding portions of energy in the Appropriations Committee, I remember everybody talking to me about the Valley of Death. With a great idea comes the requirement for the money, but the money doesn't exist, so you go through the Valley of Death. You all know that. So at the moment, I would simply say to Senator Manchin and others who have the opportunity, have the position, and have the capability now to make a difference, understand that we need direct air capture as a significant part of what we need to do to resolve these issues. This can be and should be bipartisan. The first time it came from the president, first time that we've ever seen, and second, coming from now, just for example, what we are describing in this bipartisan budget approach. These are significant moves forward for those of us that care about direct air capture and believe that is necessary for our future.
I kind of turn to you, the same question starting out politically, but let me unfairly ask you to speak on behalf of the entire nation's business community, right? An entirely unified, simple set of expectations. In my experience, and I said this a little bit at the introduction, the net in net zero is in many ways as important for folks as the zero, right? The idea that we have the ability with carbon removal to maintain some headspace in the economy for that last few percent of whether it's fossil or other emissions. It has felt to us when we've gone to the Hill that direct air capture really does have a kind of outsized influence in building political support for a meaningful energy transition strategy. But amplify that a little bit or contest it, if you will.
Sure. No, and I mean, first of all, I appreciate the invitation to be here, and I'm always honored to be on with Senator Dorgan. A lot of good setup has already been already been stated. I thought the senator did a nice job. Suchi was great. And so I think, to your point, trying to speak for the entire business community, trying to get the chamber to come together on one position is there's an art to it. It's not a science. But the fascinating thing about it is that there's no question where we're moving, where the business community is moving. The evolution on where even the big oil and natural gas companies and you name it, all making really significant commitments to reducing emissions. Some of them are putting specific timelines to that. But the fact is, it doesn't really matter. In some ways, it doesn't matter what the timeline is we set out or even what the target is. We know what we need to do. We need to be able to reduce emissions while still meeting global energy demand and doing it in a way that continues to provide affordable and reliable energy, right? So it kind of all boils down to we've got to have the technology, the policy, and the market signals to allow all that to happen. And so direct air capture kind of fits right into all that. We've got to have options, right? We've got, and because we don't know exactly how the technology will come along. I often, hearken back to the shale revolution. Who back in 2007, 2008 had predicted that we would be in a position to reduce carbon emissions in the power sector further and faster than any other country in the world. And a big part of that was the innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit and the market signals that were out there for companies to go out and figure out how to do this horizontal drilling. We've also got to be humble enough to know that something else can come along in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. So knowing that our path to net zero, regardless of when it happens, is not going to be linear. We've got to make sure we put the emphasis in place now to help get to those. Where are those jump points? But as the senator said, well, we know we can't get there without direct air capture. And so I think that if there's a theme here today, and you stated it, and it is about focusing on scale. The report points out that historically, the government funding for research in this area has been anemic by any measure. But the good news is it is improving. There has been private sector investment in this. We are, primed. It's good timing here to now move to that demonstration and deployment. And so all the good news about where the administration is focusing, where Senator Manchin's focusing, and the support of the community itself and the business community says we can actually do something here.
So Byron, Marty mentioned my favorite scale, and science and innovation requires experimentation, which invariably requires some failure, particularly if you want to have bold and rapid success. And we're not politically very good at that, right? I think if you look back at a lot of our nation's most ambitious efforts around energy technology, when the government stepped up and said, the market's just not going to deliver the solution in time, we're going to step in, whether it's syn fuels or Clinch River reactor, or more recently future gen. We haven't done it well. What do you think we should be understanding? What should we be saying to members of Congress about why it is in fact time to double down and try again? And I think maybe the question really is, does Congress is there a culture of innovation that the Congress needs to think about differently if we're going to have the ambition we need to achieve the big outcomes and basically and do it in time?
Well, I think it probably does, but we'll have to see. You understand the politics of what's happening in America and in Congress. It's not easy. It's very difficult, much more difficult than it was at one point. So we'll have to see. I think when I was involved in the appropriations process and chairman of the Energy Committee, we created something called ARPA-E. And we created ARPA-E after DARPA. And the point of ARPA-E is we should not be afraid of failure, right? Whether it's innovation or invention or experimentation, let's put some money behind some of these things and find out what works and what doesn't. And don't be afraid of failure. One of the interesting things that Marty just talked about is the shale issue. And I come from the Bakken country in North Dakota. And, we didn't know. I think you were kind of asking about what will happen 10 years from now. We didn't know back then that was going to happen. We just didn't. And we went, I think, as you've said in the past, Jason, from shortage to abundance in a nanosecond. We spent our entire adult lives worrying about being short of energy. And all of a sudden it changed and changed very quickly. So what will happen in 10 years? I don't know the answer to that, but I do think there will be a lot of new things. And let me give you some example. In addition to, the DAC issue, which is so important, there's a lot of other things going on. Carbon Cure, Forterra are two companies, for example, that are working on the issue of cement and concrete. 8% of all of the carbon from this planet comes from the production of cement and concrete. It's done all over the world, as you know. About every couple hundred miles there's a cement plant because you don't want to haul it too far. And so it and water are two of the most used products in the entire planet, and 8% of the carbon comes from that. And the fact is, there's a lot of really interesting work going on that could dramatically reduce the carbon from cement and concrete. There's discussion, a lot of discussion about what is called 45Q, and that is tax incentives that would nudge and urge the right kind of investment in these new technologies and new capabilities. And then the other issue is government procurement. Buy clean. One of the things that we can do, it seems to me, is decide that the government purchase issue of buying clean will determine exactly who's able to sell to the government and how that sale exists. Going back to cement just for a moment, the fact is there's been a lot of work of encapsulating the carbon in the cement, which makes the cement stronger. And so there's, that would, require the federal government to take a look at that and say, oh, we're going to buy that kind of product to build our highways and our roads and so on. So, and then the other thing I would say, just that Marty said earlier, and I agree with him completely, I believe there ought to be a carbon tax. I have believed that for a long while. I don't believe it's going to happen. And so as a result of that, we have to work around that and come up with other approaches, which I think we will do.
Topic with you, Marty, because I think, Byron, as usual, just kind of cut to the chase. He thinks there should be a carbon tax, and he doesn't think one's going to happen, at least not in this kind of current political environment. And it does seem like the dynamic has shifted from imagining a cap or a tax, thinking that would drive technology, to now thinking we're going to make big investments in technology, and then maybe we'll see taxes, incentives, regulation kind of on the back end to accelerate and scale. But it leaves us at this little bit of a front end problem. Senator Hickenlooper made the point that this is an expensive technology. So Byron was talking a little bit about what the kind of economic incentives might be to develop this technology in the near term. And I just wonder if you want to, you mentioned government procurement. A lot of companies are making net zero commitments just in terms of their own ambition to shareholders and customers. Any thoughts about what, from a private sector vantage point, could stimulate investments on the private sector side in direct technology in anticipation of possibly some government requirements, 10 years down the road?
Well, I mean, I do think that we're seeing that from a company standpoint, the evolution is accelerating on how they're focused on this. We still, again, I can tell you from within the membership, a lot of tensions around what type of policy will affect which sectors and what have you. But where we had clear support across the board was that we need to be focused on market-based approaches. Now, does a price on carbon a market-based approach? Yes, it is. But again, depending on how that's structured, will determine who's really impacted by it. But again, more and more companies realize that based on the commitments that they've made, what they're trying to achieve, and the pressures, frankly, that they're getting from investors and shareholders and their own workforce, they've got to figure out how to move in this direction. And so they are looking more for what are the government policies that will help them, whether that's the 45Q type of issues with regard to DAC, clearly strongly supported there. But to go back just for a second on the issue of is Congress up to this? I mean, as you know, Jason, I consider myself a radical centrist. And I think that we've got to look at the model we've seen, even though the narrative out there is that bipartisanship is dead. And there's been some, bad examples out there recently, but there's also some really good ones. And the Energy Act of 2020, but for the pandemic relief, would have been hailed as the boldest climate and energy achievement the Congress had made in over a decade. And I think we don't want to lose sight of that. I mean, there's, in addition to what was in there for DAC and many other technologies that the senator talked about, that's a model we can continue to follow. I think the the infrastructure package is coming together. Again, not to get derailed here, but that's it. If we actually are, succeed there, huge opportunities. Let's keep building on this, and so I do think that the time is right for us to be very specific about what are the the financing mechanisms and incentives needed for the private sector to continue investing in this critical technology.
Marty, let me just ask you a follow-up question, kind of drawing upon your couple of decades of intimacy in oil and gas boardrooms. So this technology, direct air capture, feels more culturally consistent with an oil and gas company than biofuels. And I think we've seen oil and gas companies for a long time think about different alternative fuels, and there's been real sincere investment there, but there's always been an ambivalence. And if you see the announcement that Exxon made about a carbon capture hub around the Houston Sea Channel, Occidental Petroleum, which is one of the members of our council, and Carbon Engineering are moving forward with this 1 million ton a year project in the Permian in Texas. It feels to me like the oil and gas industry is embracing and poised to really embrace carbon capture and direct air capture. And when it comes to scale, those are pretty big exercises. Is that a fair assessment? Is there an inflection point in enthusiasm with oil and gas on this technology compared to biofuels or algae or a variety of other ideas that have also gained some currency?
Well, I think it is a fair point, but even without putting it in, conflict or comparing it to the other technologies, let's not forget that from a carbon capture standpoint, this is an industry that's got a 30, 40-year history on capturing carbon. And you mentioned Oxy. Oxy's been a leader in carbon capture and enhanced oil recovery, and of course now a leader in direct air capture. And many other of the big companies are following along. You mentioned the Exxon, the big hub in Houston that that they'll have there as well. I will say there are other companies in the industry that are looking at this saying, we know it has to be part of our solution, but I can't make it work yet on the business side of it. So the whole conversation we're having here about what has to happen to allow these companies to to put the major investments in, these are the companies that have the scale. They've got the expertise, they've got the technology, lots of overlap as far as skill sets go from both the upstream, the midstream, and even down on the product side. So huge opportunity for the U.S. oil and gas industry to really be a springboard for this technology and all the benefits it can bring.
All right, so I think time for one final question, and I want to ask you each to say, share your thoughts, which is again, scale, speed. Net zero by 2050 is urgent. It's absolutely necessary. It's really hard, right? I mean, the scale of the transition that we have to undertake causes us to focus a lot on technology innovation. But I know I'm speaking to a choir here. Something the three of us have talked about in the past is the recognition that our democracy is going to have to undergo almost as much innovation as technology if we are going to get these technologies developed, scaled, sited, and deployed in time, right? We really have to get these things all built and on the ground in the next 20 years if we're going to have the decarbonization impact that we're looking for. And I guess I want to ask you each just to talk about that issue. I mean, for years, the siting debate has kind of been a proxy for the climate debate. We've seen a lot of folks, use siting as a way of slowing down what they perceive to be kind of an entrenchment of a heavy carbon economy. Again, there's an inflection point. There's a new coalition out there saying we need to speed up permitting in order to achieve decarbonization, but there's a lot of pushback. And so I just wanted you each to reflect a little bit on the importance of the capacity of our democracy. Do we have a regulatory structure that is capable to support success, and how you see that conversation playing out in the service of decarbonization? And Byron, we'll start with you and we'll give Marty the last word.
Well, yeah, you mentioned, by the way, my book and said you would sell 3. I wrote that book 10 years ago, and I was thinking then about, okay, what might happen? And I described microbes underground eating through a coal seam and leaving gas in their wake, and a way for us to actually communicate with microbial, it's called Esperanto, microbial Esperanto. That's the language we would use to talk to microbes. My point is, I don't know what's going to happen between now and 2050, It's hard to know in 10 years what's going to happen. The shale is an example. But let me say this, I think this is an unbelievably heavy lift. We just had an administration tell us that climate change is a Chinese hoax. So it's not as if America is marching in lockstep with an understanding of the risk and the urgency. I mean, you know, the politics, I think the science is largely settled as far as I'm concerned for everybody. The politics is not always settled here. So I think it's a very heavy lift, but what I sense is the mainstream of the two political parties, the unbelievable number of scientists who care about this and understand the urgency of it, finally believe and understand that we are at a tipping point, and the survival of our planet really depends on our success. And as a result of that, I do have more encouragement right now than I maybe should have, given the politics of America. But I believe that encouragement really requires everybody and requests everybody to come to the same place, put our shoulders to the wheel, and try to resolve this and address these issues. And direct air capture is a significant part of it.
Thank you, Byron. I thought you were going to give me one of your Prairie Home Companion, however, quotes. So you landed and ended on optimism, which for you is a unique
Thank you.
experience.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
I'm learning.
So, Marty, you know, we've talked about this a lot, but the chamber has really leaned in, embracing kind of the need for decarbonization urgency and the need for, you know, permit modernization for that to be possible. How do you see the direct air capture ambition fitting into that equation?
Well, I think, and I think I have the quote right. It's from Teddy Roosevelt. That, you know, reach for the stars, but keep your feet on the ground. So from our standpoint, we don't want to pull back on the ambition. So, you know, set out the goals, what we want to achieve, but let's make sure we're being realistic about it as well. As the senator said, it is a heavy lift. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be leaning into it, but let's be realistic about it. You've talked about, you know, permitting being one issue. You know, some of that's regulatory. I would argue some of that's also cultural, as the way things have evolved in our society here. But other issues are out there as well. It's not just, you know, permitting itself, but yes, you got to build out transmission. I did an event earlier this morning about critical minerals, and you know we're raising the question now. And you know, will lithium become the new petroleum as far as our having this clean energy dependency on other countries? Those are solvable issues, but they're not going to be solved overnight. And so, but I do share the optimism the senator has that, you know, we can build on where we are making progress here and where the private sector is actually investing heavily and make progress toward that goal.
All right, well, so let me take this moment to, first of all, thank the two of you. Thank Dr. Tulati and Senator Hickenlooper. You know, look, we've all been at this for a while together, and I share the sense that there is an inflection point, and I share both of your pragmatic expressions of urgency, that we're going to have to do a lot to seize it. You know, I think if I can editorialize on behalf of BPC, we think we are at a take yes for an answer moment in our carbon debate. I think that the 20 years of entrenched hostility are hard to get past, and there are still a lot of folks who really find the fight a lot easier than the solution. And in fact, they're right, the fight is a lot easier than the solution. But what we have been so enthusiastic about when it comes to direct air capture is it's a new idea. It was a way to re-enter a discussion that didn't have all of the baggage and friction and heat from the last 2 decades. And so we really believe that it is both from a technological, but also from a political standpoint, one of the key paths forward. I also want to thank Sasha for leading our energy work and moderating the panel with Suchi, and then Danny Broberg, who is the staff person at BPC, who makes this all happen for us. And so with appreciation to all, have a lovely and quite sunny here in Washington Thursday afternoon, and we'll be back in touch soon. Take care.
Thank you, Jason.